I want to welcome our three student panelists. I'll go ahead and give them just brief, oh yeah, please. I'll just briefly introduce the three of them, but then I'll let them do the majority of the talking. And then after they've talked a little bit about their experiences, we'll have a chance for you guys to ask them any questions that you have. So we'll save some time for Q&A. So immediately to my left is Mr. Len Alder. He is a former student of the Syracuse University College of the Law. I'm giving away the happy ending of this story to say that he's a graduate of Northwestern University School of Law from 2012. And he's currently a criminal defense attorney in Boston.
Yeah, Len.
Seated next to Len is Chelsea Boozer. She's a graduate of the University of Memphis, where she was the editor of the student paper, the Daily Helmsman, and she's currently on the staff of the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette in Little Rock, Arkansas. So welcome, Chelsea. And finally, at the end of the table is Mr. Luke Wachob. He is a former fire intern. Yeah. But he's a recent graduate of James Madison University and is currently working at the Center for Competitive Politics. So welcome back. All right, so Len, can you kick us off, please?
Sure. Well, I'd like to thank Jaclyn and everyone from FIRE for having me back this year. It's really an honor. This has become kind of the highlight of my summer, speaking here and telling people about what happened to me, which really at the time seemed like kind of a personal tragedy, but I'm glad it's become a teachable moment for schools and something that FIRE can really use to illustrate their cause, something that I'm sure most of us at this point, if we didn't before, now believe in. As Jaclyn gave away the ending, I am now a practicing attorney. I am quite sure that would not have been the case were it not for FIRE's work. I think there's every chance I would have become, as I had, quite disenchanted with law school and potentially dropped out. That was something I was really strongly considering at one point, but I didn't. And I think their tireless efforts were an extremely large part of the reasons why. So even though I left the school I was at, I did it under my own steam because we won. I chose to leave because I didn't feel happy there anymore and I was very resentful. But let's go back to the beginning. My second year of law school, I was taking a bus from Syracuse, New York to Toronto when I received an email telling me, an email from a professor whom I'd never met, telling me, and I quote, that I was being investigated and that the charges were very serious. And that was the extent of the email. I was slightly concerned, to say the least. When you're in law school, you know, anything that potentially gets in the way of you becoming an attorney and wasting all the money you've spent going to law school is quite scary. I knew it was in relation to. At the time, 12 days prior to this email, a group of friends and I set up and wrote a satirical blog, kind of in the style of The Onion, about administration, faculty, our job prospects as graduates from the second-tier law school, and life in the law school in general. It was largely benign, sometimes maybe on the tawdry side of funny, as I think most satire probably is. It wasn't the most cutting-edge satire, it wasn't the most intellectual satire, but it was satire. And we knew there was going to be some kind of response to the administration. We thought it was going to be something along the lines of, we're not happy that you guys are doing this. We didn't know it was going to be, we want to kick you guys out. So as soon as I got back from Toronto, I met with this professor who was appointed as the faculty prosecutor, which is a strange concept. He was a tax law professor. As became evident, didn't remember much of his criminal and criminal procedure law from his time in law school. And he told me in this meeting that the blog that had only had, I think, 11 posts and been online for 12 days, but had received 8,000 hits in a school of 800 students. He said that it was harassment, and he told me flat out that, you know, whoever was behind this was going to be in serious trouble. He said, I want you to take down your blog. And I said, what do you mean my blog? We wrote an anonymous blog. How do you know it was me? He said, well, we have reasons to believe. That was the extent. I was very shaken up by the meeting. I walked outside, and I remembered my time as an undergraduate when I was at Boston College, having had some friends who got involved with this group called FIRE, who had written a very angry letter to Boston College decrying their disinvitation of the supposed, actual former terrorist Bill Ayers, who's now a respected professor of education in Chicago. And when Boston College uninvited him, FIRE was very unhappy about the implications for academic freedom. So I called FIRE. I sent an email to FIRE. Didn't expect to hear anything back immediately. Received a phone call about 3 hours later saying, "Sounds like a really interesting case. Let's get on it." And that was the beginning of, I think, a historic friendship between me and the organization. And then what followed was an 8-month investigation, but to the point where the investigation became the punishment. I was treated as a pariah by the student government. I think that was the biggest betrayal. The student government, which was trying to curry favor with the administration, was more willing to turn its back on one of its members in order to foster its relationship with the dean than it was defend them in the face of a pretty egregious attack. So they didn't come to my aid. Some professors did, some professors didn't. Some professors actively supported what the administration was doing. The faculty prosecutor, Professor Germain, I think to this day, was really a stooge for the dean. He was up for tenure. I don't think he had a lot of choice. I mean, whether we could say it was cowardly for him to do what he did is one thing, but I think it was an orchestrated effort that went above his head. But I was relentlessly investigated. I was told they were going to try and kick me out of school. FIRE's first response really was a media campaign, a media blitz. Obviously, we know the procedure. They write to the school first. They said, well, what you're doing we don't think you can do. Maybe you should stop doing it. And I think the school didn't even respond. I can't remember specifically what happened early on. But certainly they weren't willing to back down. So FIRE did their press release. And the press release got picked up, not just by one or two organizations. The press release got picked up a lot. And luckily, the newspaper of the university at large, Syracuse has a very, very good student newspaper, the Daily Orange, in the Newhouse School there. And it's quite notable for its coverage of academic freedom and First Amendment issues, being in the same school as the Center for First Amendment Law at the Newhouse School of Communications. So they covered my case extensively. I think, my story was on the front page of the university newspaper something like 9 times. But still, the law school didn't care. FIRE continued its campaign, started a petition, had people emailing and writing to the dean. The school didn't care. They told me, I think it was only when we decided to escalate it and it looked like media coverage might increase, they started to get a little scared. And they said, let's try and make this go away. Let's negotiate. So we sat down 4 days before Christmas in a diner in Manlius, New York. Myself, my defense attorney, and the faculty prosecutor, and I had pancakes. They both had French toast. And he said, let's hammer out a deal. How about academic probation? I said, my GPA, that would look absurd. And you got to, for those of you who are not law students, which I realize is most of you, when you take the bar exam, one portion of the bar exam is called character and fitness, so it's not just about having scored high enough on a test, you're also being assessed in terms of the person you are. Are you the caliber of person we want to be a practicing attorney? And character and fitness varies from state to state, but it really looks at your entire background, your academic history, your personal history, your medical history. They can subpoena your mental health records. I mean, any addiction you've had, any legal problems you've had, it's all going to be there. It's all going to be assessed. And as people were telling me, my FIRE, my defense attorney, colleagues, you don't want this stuff to follow you to the bar exam. You want this to go away. So FIRE said, don't take a deal if you can avoid it. Do what you got to do, but it's not worth it. I completely agreed. So they said academic probation, full apology, and here is the kicker, and a non-disclosure agreement, which means you're going to sign a piece of paper not only not discussing that we negotiated a settlement to this case, but never criticizing Syracuse University ever again. Regardless, I don't know if that means I couldn't have made a joke about how bad the football program was that year, but it sounds like it. I would have been signing away my right to spend another 3 semesters making any kind of even constructive criticism of Syracuse University, which I think FIRE probably found most egregious of all the things they were asking me to do. I know I did. And I said, give me Christmas to think about it. And I went back and said, nope, no deal. And they said, okay, let's go into mediation. And this is how absurd this got. This little case about satirical blog ended up being mediated by a federal judge who was being paid by the university. Well, I mean, I don't think they were paying full salary, I want to be fair. But they were organizing this. They had a federal judge. We met in chambers with a federal judge who mediated between us. You know, we'd sit there and we'd talk, and we'd say, we think this is absurd. And they'd say, well, we want some kind of settlement. And one party would go out the room, and he'd talk, and this went on for a full day. They came back with another deal. They said, we want you to sign this piece of paper. It wasn't, there's no longer academic probation, but it still had an apology. It still had non-disclosure. It still had things I wasn't willing to agree to. And we said, look, we want this to go away. If we can make sure this doesn't stay on my record, let's do that. So we were hammering out the final details, and then Fire, in a moment that I still don't know if it was calculated or not, because it was truly brilliant, published its list on the Huffington Post of the 10 worst offenders for free speech, and
it was totally calculated.
It was phenomenal timing, because the list came out, and what was very much understressed was that the list, I think, was not in any ranked order. But I think, once again, it was probably strategic. The number one school on the list was Syracuse University, just one of 10, not necessarily the worst offender, but that's certainly the way it looked, and that's the way it was picked up by other media, that Syracuse University was the worst offender. And this had professors in the School of Communications saying, wait, we're in the best, one of the 5 best communication schools in the country, with the Center for First Amendment Law, and we have the worst record for free speech. And that's when donors start calling. That's when the money, that's when the Newhouse family, who are known to own a couple of reasonably large newspapers, some of which you may have heard of. That's where they start calling, I imagine, and that was amazingly brought to a head. Even though we were hammering out the details on the settlement agreement, they decided to publish a press release blasting me, disclosing the terms of our negotiations, which was against what they had actually promised a federal judge. So they were betraying their promise to me and to the federal judge. And they came out with this press release saying he did all of this stuff. He offended this person, this person, this person, and this was the problem. They said there were 3 complainants. I still to this day don't know who 2 of those complainants were, or if they existed. I only know the identity of one of them. I never found out who my accusers were. I never found out what material was offensive and what wasn't. To this day, I don't know. And when they published it, when they published the press release and the negotiations were over, they couldn't go back to the negotiating table. They essentially knew they'd lost, but they published this press release anyway, and that brought it to a head. 2 days later, I was sat in class, I received an email saying, we've concluded our investigation and we're not going to bring any charges. They betrayed me in order to release this damning press release criticizing me and saying I was an awful person, but it didn't matter because they couldn't do anything else. They couldn't go back to the federal judge and say, oh, so we broke our promise, but it's all going to be okay. I left Syracuse University because I was given the impression implicitly that I was never going to be considered for any position or anything I applied for ever again. So I went to Northwestern and had a much more enjoyable time. And as I said at the beginning, I think none of this would have happened without Fire. I mean, I'm truly indebted, and now is the part of my career, I guess, now that I'm starting my career when I get to give something back, and I hope it's going to be a very long career of giving something back. I hope Fire is around for a long time, and I look forward to being one of those people who can get in touch with students who are undergoing those things and saying, no worry, I've been there, and and by the way, they're breaking that law, that law, and that law. And I'm phenomenally indebted to everyone at Fire for that. Thank you.
Yeah.
So my case is kind of all over the place, so I'm kind of going to start in the middle, and then I'll fill you in on kind of what was going on at the time. But last spring, we got a letter that our funding, most of our funding comes, by the way, I'm talking about the student paper, but most of our funding comes from our own student ad sales, but we get about $75,000 from student activity fees, and basically it just pays for our printing so students don't have to buy the paper and we can offer that free. Historically, we've gotten, for the past 30 years since the student activity fee has been there, we've gotten between $70,000 and $75,000. We asked for $80,000 this year, and we were cut to $50,000, and we were like, wow, that's never happened before. So trying to figure out what was going on. the committee that does the funding, 2 of the members are Student Government Association, like the president and vice president, and their advisor is the chair of the committee. And we didn't have such a good relationship with them at the time, and they had been critical of us, so we were like, this sounds fishy. So we go to the chairperson of that committee, which is the dean of students, which is also the advisor to the student government. And we really just, at that time, we didn't know the full extent of what was going on. We wanted to ask him, but we didn't think that he would be dumb enough to flat out tell us like what happened. And he flat out told us that they talked about our content they didn't like. He said, I can't begin to tell you the examples of our articles that they discussed that seemed to have little relevance to the campus, they said, or to students, they said. And they pointed out, we did a profile on a Marxist student union. We found out that we had a Marxist student union as one of our registered student organizations, and we thought that was interesting. They only had like 4 members, but we did a profile on them, kind of told what they were about. And he was like, they only have 4 members, so why are you writing about them? That doesn't touch the student body. So basically anything he didn't agree with, we shouldn't have covered. But the big thing was that we did not cover, it was a pretty big SGA event. And we didn't cover it one night because breaking news of a rape happened. And we had a small staff, and I only had one, I was the editor at the time, I only had one reporter that night, and he was set to go to that event, and we heard about this rape. And so I'm like, no, get over there, we're both gonna cover the rape together. And he didn't take a liking to that we didn't cover that, I guess, SGA's event. He told us that one person voted to not fund us at all, which is obviously very punitive. We're actually in the guidelines for the student activity fee as listed the first organization to receive funding. So, and he said, this was around May or April, I don't know. He said in October when we come back, there'll be a little bit more money given out, and he gave us some stipulations to do if we could possibly get our funding back. And one of those stipulations was we had to come up with a mission statement that aligned ourselves with the purpose of the student activity fee. And I'm thinking, we're a free independent press, you're not going to tell us to write anything that aligns ourselves, we're not doing that. And he also said it didn't sit well with the committee that the editor had complete control of content and that a faculty advisor couldn't come in and say, you can't write that, or you can't do this, or whatever. They were just kind of worried about where the balance came in, I guess, and didn't trust the editor's control of that. So going back a little bit, what obviously coming out of that, we're like, okay, well, he flat out just admitted that it was content related. So we know that's a First Amendment violation, but it really got worse because of what had been going on. Back to the rape deal and us not covering the SGA event, when we covered the rape, we found out that not only was this guy accused of raping a girl in our dorms, but he was a convicted rapist already, and he didn't even go to school at our university, yet he had been staying in our dorms for a couple months. Was squatting there. Apparently no one knew he was there, and it was a couple feet from a child care facility. And the more we talked to students, this one certain group on campus knew this guy and said that he would walk around campus and say that he was going to go to class. So obviously he was posing as a student, which seems kind of fishy and kind of lured some. And a lot of girls told us, oh, he invited me back to his room too. And so, we were kind of thinking that this could have happened to more than just this one girl. And he had been on campus for about 16 hours, just roaming campus when police knew about the accused rape before they found him and arrested him and everything. And not that, I'm not saying he was a serial rapist that was going to go around and rape everyone, but still, that's kind of a little bit at danger. He knew other women, and he apparently, from what we had been told, had been trying to lure other women back to his dorm, which wasn't his. And so I wrote an editorial the next day that was an open letter to the police director, and I just told him, or I basically said that he did a disservice to the campus and to the community, but not, they never told us that this happened. We had just found out, and they are supposed to release things like that. And so I just said, it was kind of a scathing editorial. Well, that day, I didn't find out this until later, but our head lawyer at the university and our head public relations person goes to my academic dean and brings him 2 police reports that were apparently filed against me during like our reporting of this raid, one of them by a police officer. And the police officer's report was that I and my reporter were at police services and we were like chanting and marching and making a scene and all these things that totally did not happen. It was completely false. So that was alarming that a police officer would file that. And I mean, being a student journalist, we always think, we're going to fight the man. And, so we had difficulties with administrators before, but never to that level. I never like felt unsafe that a police officer was going to lie about me. And apparently from that meeting, my dean told me that they brought up both arresting me and pressing student misconduct charges against me, which I was like, okay, now this is getting serious. And then is where I kind of got alarmed. And someone earlier was talking about the Student Press Law Center, which is a lot like FIRE, but they deal specifically with journalists. And I had known the executive director of that, and so we got in touch with them. And FIRE, of course, came on later on and was very helpful too. But the Student Press Law Center got me a lawyer pro bono in case I was going to be arrested, which was totally absurd. But I was like fearing that someone would come to my door and arrest me on these false charges. And so that had all happened. And when we had written about the raid, the SGA president had sent me like a text full the next morning and so appalled we didn't cover his event. And I'm like, you should really be more concerned that the administration, didn't tell anybody about this rape, and aren't you concerned that this happened on campus? They call themselves the voice of the students, so I mean, you should be concerned about that. And he told us that the purpose of the paper should be promoting the campus, which if you know anything about journalism, no. Like, we're not there to be a fluff sheet, we're there to tell the truth, whatever that is, and whether, we write stories that make the university look good because those good things happen, that's great, but if a rape happened on campus, we're gonna let you know, because you should know that if that happened in the dorm next door to you. It gets iffy, okay, so I wrote a letter to our president about those false reports, because that was like the point for me. I was like, this is absurd, I'm not gonna deal with this. And so I wrote a letter to our university president. I was like, this is false. It was a lengthy letter. And of course, I didn't hear a response. She didn't do anything. But then SPLC wrote a letter. The investigative reporters and editors wrote a letter. Society of Professional Journalists wrote a letter. Associated Press managing editors wrote a letter. A couple other groups, and FIRE wrote a letter. And FIRE's and SPLC's, obviously having a legal background, were really good letters, and they were like scathing, and they were like, you can't do this, and you better not do this, and we're going to use all our resources to make sure you stop doing this. And we had at that point drawn a conclusion between our coverage of critical things and them bringing that up in the content process, and so which obviously is not okay and is a violation of the First Amendment. And we got our own lawyer, and we demanded that the university, 1, restore $25,000 funding, 2, do an investigation on this, because obviously it's not okay, and 3, change the way we're funded, because this is not cool that we are having to go before this board of administrators and student government officials and ask for funding when we cover them a lot, and that creates a big conflict of interest, and it obviously did in this case, and they took some things personally and took that out on us by cutting our funding. Side note, so the president did restore our funding. I don't think that she particularly wanted to do that, but I think it was definitely saving face, and after all this attention and media, our local media covered it a lot, and of course all these letters, she was like, okay, we got to do something. So she restored our funding, and she issued an investigation, which her executive director, whoever did, assistant. And I got to sit in on that, and they were really trying to welcome us and show the media, the Helmsman's a part of this, and we're going to fix this, and it's all okay. And so when they interviewed the SGA president, who I really think his voice and the SGA's influence on that committee was a big part of our funding cut, he said that what they did was take away that $25,000, and they set it aside for a newspaper that SGA wanted to do that was only going to list like campus events and They also were going to call it the Tiger Rag, which was the Daily Helmsman's former name, like back in the 60s, and I'm like, you're not going to call it that? But, so, you know, basically he was saying, we're going to take away, and then even though the SGA was going to get the money for that newsletter, we were going to do the newsletter and put it in our newspaper. So basically he said, you know, we took this money away from you, but we'll give it back if you write this content in your paper and put this in your paper. And we're like, absolutely not. Like, how can you not see? And he was going to school to be a lawyer, so I was like, what are you doing? Because I'm not a lawyer, and I didn't, you know, I know a lot about media law just because we take those classes as journalists, but it was interesting. So the investigation happened, and then the investigation came out, and he said that they wouldn't flat out admit it, but he did say that with all the content discussed, for his understanding, it was court proven that that would be enough to be a violation of the First Amendment. And, you know, I recommend giving them their funding back and setting up a committee to look at the way the Helmsman's funded. So that committee was set up. It convened earlier in January, and I got to be a part of that too, which was great. And luckily enough, they picked some faculty to be on that committee who had not heard all these other things that had happened, and when they heard that, they were like, this is wrong, you know, and they didn't really side with the university, so that was great. We issued a recommendation to the, based on how some other student newspapers are funded throughout the nation without that conflict of interest involved, and we gave that recommendation, and she's just kind of been sitting on it, and the president, she recently announced her retirement, so I don't know what's happening with that. But we're going to stick with it and make sure that someone addresses that and answers our recommendation and something happens. But I guess the moral of the story was that it was really important for us to stand up and not just back down and say, okay, we'll take that funding cut, we'll go, you know, we're a daily paper. We even thought about having to like print just maybe a couple of days a week, and which to cover a big campus like it's like 33,000 students, we really needed to be daily. I mean, we had a small staff anyways. There was stuff that we missed. If we had to be, you know, a weekly paper, we were going to miss a lot. And it was still important, even though it was tough at times. Like the dean of students sent me an email and said he was very disappointed in me, and other administrators told me that I was hurting my job aspects. And I wanted to tell them that most journalists, like when they see that another journalist is like fighting the man, they're like, hell yeah. And so I got you know, I wasn't worried about getting a job afterwards with that. But what was so important about not, you know, fighting this and not backing down was that we could potentially be changing like a 30-year system. Like for 30 years, the Helmsman has had to go in front of that board and ask for that funding. And to our knowledge, this is the first time that it got out of control and that conflict of interest was breached and everything, but it could happen again, and they could next time when they have a weaker, you know, turnover at a student newspaper is frequent, and next time when the student editor is weaker and they don't want to be in the public light and be on the news stations and they're just going to be quiet about it, you know, this committee could say, well, they could use that leverage to change our content, which is really important for that not to happen. Yeah, and so I would suggest, like, if anyone, I think most of you are not journalists or deal with the student paper, but definitely if any type of situation like this comes up, help from SPLC and fire was extremely important. And it, like in his case, it was definitely the point where the administration was like, okay, we got to do something, we can't ignore them anymore. And by the way, after all those people had written my president, she finally wrote me back with my letter. So that was great to hear back from her.
Had just been a senior in high school, and I'd taken AP Government, and I was so excited to go to James Madison University and study public policy and the Constitution. And then I get to campus, I joined a bunch of political groups, and through one of them, Madison Liberty, which is the student libertarian and student rights organization, and I ended up staying around with them and eventually becoming their president in later years. They told me, or showed, that JMU had just instituted a new policy that blatantly violated the First Amendment. And not only violated the First Amendment on JMU's campus, but across the entire globe. it's interesting, at the time we weren't quite sure, but we eventually found out why JMU had instituted this policy. And I'll tell you why before I tell you what it is. Apparently, the year before I got there, they had a problem of several JMU students flashing people in the town of Harrisonburg. And this was occurring off campus. And so the university wanted a way to bring the discipline of that conduct under its control, rather than having JMU students going through, the getting arrested by the real police and going to like a real trial or something. So that was the sort of problem that they had, which is understandable. But the policy that they wrote to deal with it prohibited lewd, obscene, or offensive conduct or expression, regardless of proximity to campus. So, yes, that does deal with the flashing people in Harrisonburg problem. But it also means that while I'm on summer break traveling Europe, I post something on Facebook that JMU doesn't like, it also means they can punish me for that. So after a weekend, you guys laughed, of course, it's obviously ridiculously overbroad. And understanding their goals ended up being a really important part of us being effective, because it allowed us to propose things, changes to the language, that would satisfy their concerns while also making our speech free. And at first, though, we didn't exactly know what to do with this, because we had this policy in the student handbook. But you probably know, other students are not all that interested in the student handbook or the policies that are in it. And we didn't have somebody who had the policy come down on them, because it was brand new that semester. But we didn't want to wait for somebody to get horribly censored. And also, you don't want to just trust that power with administrators in the first place. But what could we do about it? So we had one of our members write an op-ed in the student newspaper, which is always a great start. It's a pretty easy thing to do. And Fire named that speech code their speech code of the month. And that really got things going. Suddenly the administration cared. And because they were getting these articles, they were hearing about it, and they felt a little bit of pressure. And once you explain it to them, you don't need to ban expression in order to keep people from flashing people. They were more or less willing to make a quick change on that policy to make it go away. But going through that process in that semester and talking to Fire, particularly Samantha Harris, who was a huge help with all of this, revealed to us that we actually had 3 additional policies that were problematic from a constitutional perspective. So we had the administration's ear from fighting this somewhat high-profile battle. We felt like we had a decent model for change in that using the student newspaper, working with Fire to make sure that we had language we could propose to the administration. And so we set about working on those 3 policies. And those were a 48-hour wait period for any demonstration on campus, a ban on any flyers that are not in good taste or display images of drugs or alcohol. There's a couple things that were specifically prohibited. And it had a bad incitement clause. It prohibited any speech that provoked somebody to a violent act. So, instead of stopping you from telling people to commit violence, it was basically saying if somebody hits you, it's your fault. So it's the total opposite direction that policy should be done. But in large part, JMU had not intended to censor people. They had done what many administrators do, which is appropriate themselves a pretty wide, broad set of powers so that they could use their discretion. Administrators like things being at their discretion. Those of us who are concerned with student rights are much more apt to be opposed to that, on very strict guidelines. So we engaged the university with Fire's help, saying on each of these policies what they could do instead. And it took 2 years. And it's funny that it took 2 years when you consider that all I'm telling you about the administration is that they had an ear and they were willing to help and they were willing to make these changes. Because bureaucracies are slow, and they work on issues where you can, like when the first speech code got brought up by Fire, when there is a large incentive to do it. So what really worked for us was just being incredibly persistent. You email them again, you go to their office, you keep telling them over and over again, this is an issue that we care about, and it's not just an issue that we care about for this week or next week. We're not going to stop talking about these things until you change them. And eventually, you can make progress like that if you don't have somebody who's really standing in your way. So we were able to get them to change the 48-hour requirement to a 48-hour request. Now they say, please give us 48 hours notice on these things. But if something happened, you have the right to organize and speak on campus, immediately. Which, for things that, the example we talked about was like, suppose on September 11, 2001, that would probably be a night that a lot of students would want to gather together and hold some sort of a vigil. It would be ridiculous to make them wait until September 13th or 14th to do that. And largely the administration agreed with that point. And so they were more or less willing to go along with that. I think with Fire's assurance, or our assurance from Fire's information that could be done, they wouldn't be like the only school in the nation that allowed that to happen. There were other green lights in Virginia. UVA and William & Mary had recently had it and gotten good press. That was another thing, the carrot and the stick. Fire had praised the other Virginia schools, and I think JMU wanted to get in on that. So they were able to change that requirement for us. They fixed the incitement language so that it had the legally defined terms in the right order. And then the last one took a little bit longer. And what finally did it for us is we decided to just demonstrate exactly what we were talking about. So with Madison Liberty, we're a libertarian club. Somewhat unsurprisingly, we were holding an event about marijuana legalization, and we were going to promote it with a flyer. So we said, this is a great opportunity to also deal with the speech code. We'll put a giant marijuana leaf on the flyer. That's basically all it is. Just a green flyer with a big marijuana leaf instead of the time and where we're going to go. And so we put this down on the administrator's desk to be stamped, and they take the approval and they stamp it approved. And then we show them the policy. It says, no, this is not allowed. We can't do this here. You need to stop us and censor us unconstitutionally. And they were like, oh, we didn't want to shut down legitimate debate about issues like drug legalization. We wanted people to not be able to advertise off-campus parties with underage drinking. It's like, so you made a policy that said all posters must be in good taste and then didn't define that? Like, isn't that absurd? And so we kept asking, and at that point we had a president and administration that knew they would be leaving within a couple years. The president was going to retire. And so we started making the point, maybe you guys are great, great arbiters of good taste, because we don't have a case of this being abused so far. But you're not going to be the person that's here forever. Someone's going to inherit these policies that's not you, and you just cannot leave the rights of your student body in the whims of these administrators. So again, they more or less agreed with us and said, okay, and they much more narrowly tailored their policy to actually do what they wanted it to do. You can easily prohibit advertisements of underage drinking without criminalizing or banning that wide range of speech. And so this started in the fall of 2009 when we were red light, and then by the fall of 2011, they finally made that change. And we got our green light from Fire. I wrote a glowing op-ed in the student newspaper. The editorial board did. Fire's given them a lot of good press in the years since because they've maintained their green light. And so I think the lesson of my story is it's easy to focus on these fascinating examples of extreme overreach. But red light policies are pervasive. They are all over the country. And not all these administrations are necessarily going to be the ones that are doing the most egregious abuses. And you can be effective at reforming these policies without having that one student who gets expelled that you can go and have them go on Fox News or something. You can do it just by understanding the goals that the administrators are trying to accomplish, being well informed and having Fire's assistance on what a legal policy would look like, and being very, very persistent in saying to administrators, do this, we're still paying attention, we're still aware. And in our case at JMU, we were successful, and we celebrated with a big free speech wall event. And I noted that when we did that, it was, some free speech walls get kind of ugly. There's a lot of it's like your one chance to say whatever you want, and there's a lot of F the president in things like that. But we had a green light, and we had a campus community that seemed to respect free speech, and our free speech wall did not get filled with that sort of stuff at all. It was kind things. It was about I love so-and-so, I like this group, I like bacon was up there with a million plus ones. And to me, it just really showed that the psychology of having to like vent because you're being cramped and suppressed in other areas wasn't here, because people had full freedom of speech. They didn't feel like they had to seize on the opportunity to be vulgar. And so I think that not only is it necessary from a rights perspective, I think it's great policy for a university and university environment. So I highly encourage everyone to reform their speech codes and try to do that, even if you think that the administration has done a pretty decent job with it, even if you think that there's not the sort of attractive case to put forward. You can do it just by being rational, reasonable, and highly persistent. Thank you.
So Greg gets to go first.
I just wanted to add something. I had the fun of interviewing Chelsea yesterday about her case, and it's a really, it's a great case. It's a really complicated one. And one thing that really stuck out to me was what the cops had charged her with, the violation that they were entertaining and wanted to actually punish her under, was that she was media that was in the dorms. And that they have a blanket ban on media in the dorms, and that also includes the student media. And we successfully fought these, Harvard even tried to actually have a ban on people in the medical school talking to the media without running it through a PR flag, and we've defeated codes like this all over the country. I didn't realize that codes like that have actually succeeded to a large degree. We're so entrenched that they actually could say with a straight face, well, you were a student journalist in the dorm, so, we're going to arrest you. So definitely that struck out to me. And if you guys have a policy, if you look into your policies and find a policy like that, definitely let us know.
All right, well, we'll open it up to questions now. So who has a question for our student panelists?
My question is for Len. How did you feel that your prior case impacted your choices with law school or your law career in the future and after? Like, how did it affect really the way that you perceive not only the law school community but also the greater legal community at large?
Well, it made me realize, I think all people do at some point in law school, that lawyers are kind of a spineless bunch. I think everyone else in the world already knew that, but when you want to be one, you're not willing to admit it. I think the most important thing it did for my legal career was realize that I wanted to have a legal career. A lot of people, I know I'm guilty of it, go to law school because they don't know what to do next. And I was like, well, I'm foreign, I'm not from the United States. I wanted to stay here. And going to grad school is a great way of staying. If if you're an international student, you just keep the degrees coming. So I stayed, and I didn't really know. I knew I was interested in law. I found it fascinating. I wasn't sure I wanted to be a practicing attorney. After my case, I knew I wanted to be a trial lawyer. I just knew. It was like due process. This stuff's awesome. I wasn't that interested in criminal law. I wasn't even vaguely interested in criminal law. I thought it was awful. I did terribly in criminal law my 1L year. It was my worst class. But that changed. I shouldn't even admit that on camera. No one's seen my transcript. Well, but I mean that's what it really did for me. It got me fired up. I hate to use that metaphor. I know we've used it so much already. It got me really fired up about the prospect of being an attorney, because it made me think I have a responsibility to help other people who've gone through this. But it did also make me realistic about, I think, the limitations of the legal community. We'd like to think that all of these lawyers out there are Clarence Darrow, are all Gregory Peck standing up and fighting for injustice. That's 0.1% of attorneys, which I think is very sad. But it made me realize I wanted to be in that 0.1%. I wanted to be one of the ones who does make a difference. I want to do pro bono. I want to work with students who, luckily, I'm now going to be at a firm that deals with actually a lot of the litigation involved in these hearings. They actually represent students who are being charged by the universities and colleges. So it gave me a renewed interest in being an attorney, but it also made me realistic, I think, about the limitations of the human beings within that profession.
Okay.
At what point, what variable or action or event took place that made you just have this epiphany that you have a case, and not just that you have it, but that you're willing to put the emotional capital and the time in your life to go forward and the process behind it? I don't know if that makes sense as a question. To all three of you, not just a case, but in the reform too, what is it that made you just seminally go, okay, this is worth my time and my effort, and I'm going to do this either for your own personal reasons or because of the greater effect? Like, is there a specific variable that took place, or was it purely fire alone, or I mean, did you just self-reflect? What?
For me, and I think my answer for a lot of things is different because I do have this journalism background, this free press background, which obviously I'm a passionate journalist, and free press is extremely important to not only me, but all of you out there, whether you are in the press or not. And so the fact that I knew I had a case when I knew the First Amendment, I knew media law, and when the chairperson of the committee told me that they didn't like our content, they didn't like that we were editorially independent, I was like, nope, not going to happen under my watch. We're going to stay editorially independent, and you're not going to cut our funding because of that. And I think that I'm kind of an aggressive person in that sense anyways, and so, and I'd already been like fighting the administration for whatever cliche that is with my arrest thing, and the fact that those were such false charges. I was going to stand up for that because that not only made me look bad, who I had never had any student misconduct before, and I was in a lot of clubs, and I was very active on campus, and so those police reports got forwarded to like every top administrator, like ones I didn't know. Like the ones that I knew I wasn't so worried about because they hate me anyways, but at least they know that I'm a good journalist. But the other ones don't even know me, so they're like, oh, this editor over here is acting crazy in the police services, she's breaking into student dorms without permission, and all this stuff, and I didn't want my name to be sullied like that, but also it made the helmsman look bad, and we were at a point where our content was, yeah, the committee couldn't look at our content, but and base our cuts on that, but our readers could, and they can have all the opinion they want about what we cover and whether they like us or not, and we were being looked at really closely, and I didn't want us to have all these charges that were false and people to take that and not hear what we had to say about it, not hear that that's not really what happened. And I forgot the other part of your question, so.
I mean, for us, it's not that hard of a question because it wasn't something where, I mean, in some cases here you have someone whose their life or their career is like somewhat on the line. And that wasn't the case for us. And we were a student libertarian club who tend to be into these sorts of things. So we were really gung-ho. We were just worried that there wouldn't be enough that we could do, more so than considering maybe not taking up the fight. Because I think, that's the First Amendment. That's a core freedom. And when colleges are violating that, to us it was immediately the biggest problem in our university's policies was that. So it was a pretty easy decision for us to try to target it. We were just lucky that FIRE's around to help us with it so that we could be effective and have a long campaign instead of just being, a group of 10 or 12 people sitting in a room complaining about it.
My motivation was really, it was twofold. One, I don't want to get kicked out of law school. Two, I don't want to get deported from the United States of America, which will happen if I'm kicked out of law school, because my student visa will be revoked. And that was a scary prospect. Really, they kind of mess with the wrong guy. If you're a law school, you want to kind of be careful trying to do anything to your own students anyway, because there's no one more arrogant than a first or second year law student. It's only when once you pass the bar you realize how little you know at that point. But when you're a first year, you're like, don't worry, I got this. I'm a first semester law student. So that was their first mistake. The second mistake was picking on a guy who'd already been writing somewhat cutting satire about the failings of the administration, because those aren't the kind of people who are going to go, yeah, fine, kick me out. But I knew FIRE, I knew the work they'd done. One of my good friends' brother was actually working with FIRE at the time. I left that out. But my friend Tom Smealy's brother, Kyle, was working with FIRE, so I had that connection. That was what was useful. I was like, I've heard of what this group does. I know a little bit about their motivation. This sounds like the kind of thing that might interest them. Didn't expect that phone call 3 hours after the email saying, let's do it. But my motivation was, I know these people do this, for a living. I know that I can't do this on my own. Balancing a full course load, some first semester, second year law students take an easy semester because 1L year is pretty tough. I didn't, so I had a pretty intense course load while I was undergoing this investigation. I didn't have time to be dealing with this ongoing investigation and the stress. I needed help, and I knew that. And so I took on a private defense attorney, offered his services pro bono, but before that, I enlisted the help of Fire, or they elected to help me, and it was the absolute key to winning the case. I definitely couldn't have done that alone.
Question about the involvement of your student governments in your cases. Why do you think it is that the student governments weren't more on your side? I don't think you talked much about what the student government did, but it'd be nice to.
Yeah, the student government is a joke and a fraud, and it's entirely irrelevant in that process. We didn't really, this is the sort of student government that had like somebody lose their job for like fraudulently inflating the vote count on like the Mr. and Mrs. Madison competition for homecoming. That's the level of serious stuff that they're into. Investigating too many free t-shirts were given away to the wrong people first. So we didn't consider them a very serious ally. I do regret not trying to build more of a coalition. We probably would have been more effective if we had enlisted the college Democrats and Republicans more so than we did. So I think you certainly should use the allies on campus that you have, but at JMU, and I think at a lot of schools, the student government is not really an effective route to go for that.
I think as much as I talk bad about the student government, and obviously they did incredibly wrong things, the president was a smart guy, and he thought he was doing good. Like, he thought that the paper should only talk good about the university, and he was very firm in that, and anything to do with the university should only talk good about the university, and we should get God, or he should get at us for bringing up questionable things such as the rape and some other things we had done. Obviously they weren't on our side. So
I think law school student governments are kind of a weird concept, because as an undergrad you're like, yeah, I'm gonna establish myself politically, I'm gonna rail against the man, whatever you go into student government for. In law school, your number one priority is I'm gonna get a job, and this hugely disincentivizes you actually doing anything as a student representative. Because you don't want to annoy the people who are in charge of your bar application and who are in charge of your references and your grades and your future as an attorney and as a human being with debts. So student governments, I think, are inherently more spineless in law schools. Mine was particularly spineless. One of the most annoying things was that the president of the student government actually spoke out against the concept of the expression itself in the blog, not just said, someone should be punished. Said this is offensive material. One of the posts was about him. Of course, what do you expect? You're the president of a student government. You think a satirical blog's not going to write something about you being a spin instructor who tries to seduce undergrads? Of course they are. In the end, they didn't come to my help. A lot of them actually came to regret that. That means a lot to me. That man, Steve Goodstadt, was, before this, one of my good friends. During this, was one of my worst enemies, and is now one of my best friends. I'm seeing him in about 9 hours. But I think that's student governments. I think they're servants of two masters, of the students and of the administration. And I think they're all too willing, at both levels, in graduate school and undergrad, they're all too willing to not fight the small fights so that they can supposedly save this political capital for the big fights. You know what I mean? Well, we're not going to deal with this because we're going to want something from the administration down the line. And that's the compromise of all government. Of course it is. But I think if you pick and choose your battles based on, expecting the big storm to come, you're going to, neglect your essential role as a representative of students' rights.
I thought I saw a hand over there. Okay.
You mentioned, Chelsea, about looking at other places' funding models for how to remove the content bias from that process. What did you find, and what did you issue as your recommendation?
yeah, I wish I had researched that before I came, because we gave a couple different options, but one thing was like a dedicated amount, since obviously when the student activity fee policy was written in 1984, we were included, and then a reasonable person would think that the paper offers something to students and to the university. Not these reasonable people, but most reasonable people. And so we would just get like a dedicated amount, like so much percent of student activity fees that equals about what we get right now. And then, so if enrollment went down, our funding would go down, but that's okay because we're printing less papers because we got less people to read that. So we were trying to be really fair. Like, it's okay if we get less funding if it makes sense. If you really don't have the money or there really are less people, then we are printing for less people. And there were a couple different ones that was pretty much very similar to that, and that was the main one that I think we were in favor of. And so we did recommend that, and the president, who had not yet announced her retirement, but everyone kind of knew anyways, had referred it down to the vice president, who met with us, and I've written editorials about her too, particularly the way when they announced that we were going to get our funding back, she cut everybody else who got funding a little bit so we could have our funding back. And in the letter, she said basically that you can go ahead and operate on a deficit. We're cutting this, but we're really not. So I wrote an editorial about how that was really stupid and you were just trying to make the Helmsman look bad because you're not even cutting them, but you told them that you had to cut their funding to give it to us. So anyways, her and I had that background, and when she came in and she read our recommendation, and the administration told us to meet with her, the committee that was doing the funding, and she was just she didn't have anything to say. She'll look at it. And some of the things we brought up, she was like, well, we actually didn't violate the First Amendment. We never said that. And so I don't really know where it's going right now. They made sure for this next school year that we'll get the same amount of funding we do, and they're still looking at our recommendation, which they've had for about 7 months. But like someone said, bureaucracy, so.
I have a question for everybody. I think Len talked about this a little bit. What were the reactions of the students on campus?
We got countless letters to the editor. A lot of alumni wrote to the university and said that they will no longer send in their annual gift, but instead they'll send it to the Helmsman, which was really awesome. And even what was even better than, the students coming and supporting us, we did get a lot of backlash from like the government type students, and everyone in the SGA was all on Twitter like bashing my name and saying really like stupid things that didn't really have to do with anything, and bashing the Helmsman. And they called us, oh man, they had a really good like little quirky name for us that was interesting, and it was funny, but it was bad. And so they spoke out a lot against us, but we had like professors and like the nursing school came to me and they said how proud they were that we were standing up for this, and the art department came to us, and so it was really awesome to have those other people in the administration, whether they were just faculty. Sometimes we look at them as the administration too, when they're not, but that they were standing up for us, and they were like, yeah, the administration is doing wrong. And even some of the professors were willing to openly write that letter and let it be printed in our paper. So overwhelmingly, we were supported, and that was cool.
Yeah, I would say generally we had pretty high student support too, particularly in the beginning with that first policy, regardless of proximity to campus, because we were able to put that in a very sort of short snippet of like, they could censor your Facebook posts. And everybody on college, that's, as a freshman, you show up, you meet people, you friend them on Facebook. It's a very, especially in 2009, it probably still is today, a very important networking tool for getting to know people in a campus environment. So I would say there was a good deal of outrage about that, and Fire actually sent a speaker to campus, Luke, who's not with them anymore, and we had really good turnout for that, for our events. As a student libertarian club, sometimes you're working on issues that don't necessarily attract a great deal of attention from the wider student community, or sometimes even unpopular ones. Like at the same time, we were selling shot glasses that said lower the drinking age. Which, considering they had that posting policy for good taste, you got to wonder how they let us like sell shot glasses advocating for lower drinking age. But they sell shot glasses in the bookstore too, so I guess they would be hypocrites. But so we had, I think, a groundswell of student support there. But as we gained like that significant victory, but getting all the way to green, I think it was less and less sort of interest in fixing those other policies. We did the best that we could trying to, for everyone, come up with a really short way of explaining to people the problem, talking about incitement, saying, this is going to punish you for saying something that somebody decides to hit you for. Talking about 48 hours in terms of doing like the 9/11 visual example. Every time we made those arguments, they seemed to be persuasive with the student body, but it was difficult to maintain a high level of interest because I think the slowness of bureaucracies is too much for a lot of people. Fighting a 2-year battle is hard. A lot of the people that started this graduated before it ended, and that was unfortunate. But I would say they were with us at any moment that we really, really needed them. It was just difficult to maintain that high level of support for the whole process.
For me, it was very mixed. I've heard Greg talk before about kind of the lack of First Amendment literacy of our generation, and I think what was shocking in my case was the debate among students and academics wasn't whether we had the free speech rights to say what we're saying. It was does it make the school look bad or not? This was the debate. Some people said having a satirical blog makes the school look bad. Law schools only care about their reputation because the rankings are everything. And getting the right candidates to apply and be accepted is everything to a law school. So they said, does this make us look bad? The school said, this makes us look bad, therefore we're punishing it. Not, they missed out that logical next step, which is, and do we have the right to punish it? And for students, that was the debate too. So very few people seem to discuss whether or not we had the right to say what we were saying. It was really, are they making us look bad? Lawyers are cautious. They're conservative people. They don't like risk. That's why everyone hates, in-house counsel at every company in the world, because they're the ones who say, I don't know if you can do that. And so a lot of students were saying, well, yeah, maybe this makes us look bad. And they didn't get to that important step of saying, but the right to say it is more important than whether it makes our school look bad. So it was very mixed. I'm not going to say I had this huge groundswell of support. It made me realize who my friends were. And it made me realize, and some of those people were people I'd never even talked to. I mean, I made friends through this that I knew their names, I'd seen them on campus, I didn't know who they were, and they came up to me and said, we're with you. That meant so much to me. I think that's such an important thing, having that support, because you still got to walk into that school every day, wherever you are, however big your college is, you've still got to walk across that campus every day. And it's hard if you have that feeling that everyone knows who you are and that they're looking at you. It really helps if you get that pat on the back every so often. So having those allies really made a difference, especially the faculty allies who fought for me. But no, it was mixed. I'm not going to pretend that there weren't a lot of people saying, we think this makes our school look bad. All we care about is getting jobs out of here. So, this hurts me. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but I think they're missing the important issue.
I think we have time for one more question.
Where can I purchase one of these shot glasses? That's really clever.
They sold pretty well, I gotta say. I kept a couple for some friends. You want to get in contact, I'll send you one. But.
All right. Okay, well, thank you so much to everyone.